So today we are going to take a look at The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. This is kind of seen as one of the most important pieces of, scientific literature regarding evolution or contemporarily regarding evolution. And we're going to talk about kind of four main ideas from it, not in any great detail because I think he explains it in a way that is much better than I can explain it, but just kind of talk about the concepts themselves. And that is first, and he doesn't talk about this much, but evolution as an iterative process. Second, replicators. Third, altruism. And fourth, memetics. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to point out and just talk about is evolution is an iterative process by which something can go from like a crazy jump in what is possible can be made. And so like a good example of this is there was this case where there was a bunch of field mice, and all the field mice were pretty universally brown, I think it was the color, and they live next to a volcano. The volcano erupts and covers the ground in black soil, or it turns a bunch of igneous rock, so now it's black. And the brown mice stand out quite a lot on the black rocks, which made them victims to birds of prey at higher rates. And you see this instance where, because they are less fit in that sense, after several generations, like 50 years, the mice went from being basically all brown, which was what the previous rock was, to all black. And so it is a sort of subtle process that produces a profound effect, and it does it through iterative type of just like small tweaks and little change. You know, you have genetic variation, very slight. There's a mutation, something very small, and if it has a small bump in your ability to, pass on your genes, or for your genes to pass on the genes, as we'll get to in replicators, it creates a small little movement, and over the course of several hundred generations, you create really profound effects. And I think this is applicable particularly in modern days, in regards to AI, because this is how AI works. Is AI can just, with machine learning, what the machine does is it just brute force plays like a million games. So a machine learning, what was it, AlphaGo? No, not AlphaGo. AlphaZero for chess. What that did is it just learned a whole bunch, and it did it by playing a bunch of chess games against itself. And so it would just play like millions of chess games against itself, brute force, and try and figure out how the best way to play. You can kind of think it very similar to evolution, where each time it plays a game of chess, it's like a generation of an animal. But the thing about machines is they can calculate really, really, really fast. And so you can play millions of games of chess inside of an hour or whatever it is. And so this iterative, like, trial and error sort of thing at hyperspeed with AI is interesting. With evolution, you get it at molasses speed, but you get it over the course of millions of years, so you get the same effect, something very profound, and something that Richard Dawkins talks about a lot in interviews and talks he's given. I'm not sure if he mentions it in the book, I can't quite recall, is how the development of the eye, how it could have started. And if you think about it, if you were designing an eye from scratch, it has a pretty big flaw in it, which is that at the back of the retina, I can't remember the names of everything exactly, but at the back of your eye, there's a giant hole that you have a blind spot, and that's where the occipital nerve comes in. And if you were designing an eye from scratch, you would never design it like this, but this is a product of how it evolved over time. And one explanation he gives for how it's possible that you would have developed an eye in the first place, or how eye could have slowly developed, because everything has to develop slowly and iteratively, is you just have some sort of organ, let's not call it an eye yet, and all it can do is detect light. And so just being able to detect light will let you know if it's like night or day, and this is a useful adaptation. It could also detect a shadow of a predator overhead, and this sorts of thing. And then he goes through little by little talking about how, the eye gets like a three-dimensional shape to it, which allows it to see depth and like color and like all this stuff. You can look it up. Richard Dawkins talking about an eye. Okay, so that's about like iterative processes. And I think that this is kind of an important concept, because this is also how science works too, right? Where you just try something and it's just trial and error, and you try and prove stuff false, and through repeated experiments, or actually new experiments that are tweaked as a result of the results of the previous experiment, that's how you expand knowledge. Okay, so this is kind of just a setup for why evolution might be important. And this book goes in and talks about evolution quite a bit, obviously. And what it does is he very, very clearly outsets, you can tell by the splash quote, "I speculate that we shall come to accept the more radical idea that each of our genes is a symbiotic unit. We're gigantic colonies of symbiotic genes." What was kind of revolutionary about what Dawkins argues, although I believe it's in the literature before he argues it, but he made it more mainstream. I think this book was written in the 70s, is the idea that evolution is not about the individual unit or the individual themselves. It's about the genes. So you don't look at things from the perspective of the individual, you look at it from the perspective of the genes. And so one common criticism of evolutionary biology or the evolutionary perspective was, okay, but how do you explain altruism? Like, why would someone risk their lives to save another one? And he offers up a particular example of, saving a sibling. If I have half my mother's DNA and half my father's DNA, and my brother also has half my mother's and half my father's, we both share roughly 50% of the DNA because we will have a quarter of each parent in common. So I will have a quarter, what's the best way to put this? Roughly half of the DNA I got from my dad, which is a quarter of my DNA, will be the same as my brother's. And roughly half the DNA I got from my mom will be the same as my brother's. And so quarter plus quarter, it's half. Okay, so if you have a gene for risking your own life in order to save your brother's life, for example, as long as the risk isn't too big, what will happen is that gene will tend to pass itself on. Because if let's say I will 100% save my brother and I will only die a quarter of the time, this gene will come into the population and it will just grow and grow and grow because when I save my brother, there's a 50% chance he has the same gene. And so the saving my own life, in terms of just thinking about it from just that one gene's perspective, has about roughly the same value as saving my brother's life twice. If that makes sense. Or if I have two brothers, saving two brothers' lives is roughly the same as saving my life with a couple asterisks. Like, I'm certain that my life is mine, but I'm not certain that my brothers share my DNA, right? And so what this book did is it helped to explain how, it's not from the perspective of the individual or the good of the species. Kind of what people thought that was an evolutionary mechanism beforehand was like, okay, it's what's for the good of the species, and then they refined it a little bit. They're like, oh, it's what's the good of the individual, survival of the fittest, and then the final stop is what's good for the gene, which Dawkins talks about as the replicator, and it's the most basic unit that anything can happen at, and it's just about that. So back to the colonies bit, or I suppose back to the colonies bit, the way he talks about towards the end chapters about parasites and also the evolution of like multicellular, multi-organ organisms is quite interesting, because he talks about how initially, so a parasite is like any organism that is growing inside you that is maladaptive, right? And so if I have a tapeworm that eats my food and denies me of nutrients, it's maladaptive. What happens is a lot of animals that, if they pass on, I wish I knew how tapeworms reproduce. They don't reproduce through your reproduction, I think is kind of the most basic way to put it. And so if a parasite starts to get passed on the same way you pass on the genes, i.e. sexual reproduction, then they actually become symbiotic with you and will start to help you out. And an example of this is like the whole gut microbiome thing, where your microbiome in your gut is helping you, and it has incentive to help you because some of it gets passed on, through reproduction, because you inherit some of your mother's gut microbiome. This is my understanding. Dawkins didn't talk about it like that. He had a different example. I can't remember his example. But the point is that the difference between a parasite and some sort of other symbiotic unit that like reproduces in your body is just the mechanism of reproduction. And if they piggyback the same ones, like if they are dependent on you reproducing sexually, then you will get a situation where they become symbiotic. And what Dawkins talks about when he talks about how we initially became like multicellular, multi-organ organisms is how all of these kind of, what would happen is all of these different multi-celled organisms or different organisms bundled together in a symbiotic way because they shared the same sort of piggybacking on the way they reproduced, like sexually. And as a result of this, it allowed for very complex organisms to evolve, even though they're just a giant bundle of different colonies of genes, and the most basic unit is the gene, not the body of a human. And this is like something that's kind of, he spends the whole book kind of unpacking this, and it has some complexity. But if you take a step back and you think about, okay, what are the implications of this sort of thing, or like why is this interesting, or like these sorts of questions, I find it tremendously interesting because it's not like readily intuitive that it's going to be at the genetic level, but then when you see it, it's like it aesthetically everything falls into place and everything starts to make a whole lot of sense, and you can kind of, the model like works as it were. Okay, so now we have the fourth thing I wanted to talk about, which was memetics. We talked about altruism, we talked about replicators, and we talked about iterative processes. Now, memetics, the idea of the meme, was in fact invented by Dawkins. I think it was coined in this book. It might have been coined in his previous book, but I'm not 100% sure. But a meme is a cultural unit of reproduction. And what Dawkins argued is that memes are replicators of sorts, and they use vehicles, human body and cultural discourse, in order to replicate themselves. So just like how a gene uses a human body to replicate itself, a meme uses the body to replicate itself. And it's very fascinating. He doesn't talk about it too much in the book, but to think about how ideas evolve in the same sort of way as genes do, not by virtue of, helping society or even helping the host of the meme, as it were, but just by virtue of what's good for spreading it. So, for example, there's a lot of genes that may not help the individual themselves, like the saving the brother gene and risking your life, but it helps the gene out, so it spreads it. In the same way, there's a lot of memes that might not help the host, like being viciously... I don't want to get too political with this, but being just tribal in general and being very aggressive and hostile towards others, there's some genetic components to this, but in general, stuff that has to do with danger and like outgroups and sex, all of these make for good memes. Like, it's good for transferring ideas, also ideas being very simple. I think there's like a fourth thing, like fecundity, how well the idea spreads, how much the idea resembles it when it does spread, like how, what is it? It's not fecundity. Fecundity is how fast it spreads, but how true to the original idea it is every time it spreads, and also how long it stays in the organism and continues to spread, like, so fads die out quick, so they are not as strong in terms of the memes. But it's very interesting to think about because a lot of people think that when an idea is really prevalent, it's because it's a good idea. But this isn't necessarily the case. It's because it's good at spreading. And once I think you adopt this perspective, it really changes the way you consume media and ideas, I think. As long as you're aware of this, you can stop and ask yourself, is this idea good or is it just good at spreading? And there's an example that I find particularly interesting, and that's Halloween candy. Halloween candy, every single year, you see news reports of, like, razor blades in the Halloween candy. I have attempted to search for any instance of there being razor blades in the candy. And I encourage anyone in the comments who's ever actually had a case of this happening and can show me the case to please do it. But I've never been able to find a single case of razor blades in the candy. And yet, like every Halloween, you hear about this razor blades in the candy business. And if you think about it, it certainly makes sense why you hear about it every Halloween. Because the idea is very simple, and it's very easy to sum it up every time anyone talks about candy. So it's like easy to spread, but it also triggers something in us because it's talking about danger, and it's talking about danger to kids specifically. And so these types of things are very good at spreading, an idea that's... And so it's not surprising that you hear about this all the time. And then you have, like, on the other hand, very unsexy ideas that might be very, very good for the host. Like, getting good sleep is incredibly good for you. I think there's, like, a study where, like, if you get really bad sleep, your learning is decreased by, like, 40%. Your ability to assimilate new ideas, something like this. Don't quote me on that. What is it? I think Matthew Walker has a book on sleep, and that's, like, where I'm getting that from. But an idea like that won't spread very well because there's no danger, there's no sex, there's no violence involved, right? And so it's this... When you're evaluating ideas in terms of, like, what spreads really well, like, anything that's current news or whatever on YouTube here, it will tend to get a ton of views and then, like, kind of dies out and, like, this sort of thing. But being very sensationalistic about it is a good way to get more views. And, the views do not validate the quality of the thing. They validate the quality it has at spreading itself. And so I think that this application of evolutionary biology, the concept, is incredibly useful. And on this basis, like, this is kind of where the utility of the book comes from. And so let's get into the ratings. So I gave it a utility of 3.5, which is not tremendously high, because I think that while it is really useful in this regard, it's not really it doesn't really talk about the memetics or the spread of ideas too much. It's about the evolutionary biology and how that works. And while these mechanisms are tremendously interesting, at least to me, it is not going to be very useful in your everyday life. And also, I also think that if you interpret everything, I think this is a book that's easy to misinterpret. Or not even misinterpret, but you can take a really jaded look at it, where there's no such thing as people doing stuff for other people. People are just doing things for their own gain, like this sort of stuff, like a very selfish, jaded type of look on reality. And to that end, I think this book would actually be not useful if that's what it instills in the reader. That's not necessarily the perspective I get, but I've read other evolutionary biology books where I kind of got that little feel. And I felt that, like, maybe I shouldn't have read this type of thing. I'm thinking of Red Queen, if I recall correctly, although that one's just about reproduction, and so, like, maybe it gives you a jaded look on relationships. Or it's on reproductive strategies, more so than anything else, in which, that's a different book. Okay. For Novelty, I gave it a 7, because I think if you've never kind of encountered some of these ideas that I've discussed, and I kind of just discussed them without necessarily explaining them too well, that this is a good look, and that, if you've never kind of looked under the hood of, like, iterative development of ideas, as I kind of talked about at the beginning, of which this is an example of a justification for why iterative processes are so good. I think that if you've never seen that's probably a bad thing. It is pretty common, to see someone be like, oh, trial and error is important. And over the course of a ton of trial and errors, you get pretty substantive results, just tweaking something very small. Like, this is not an idea that's tremendously hard to find, but I think it's important. So that's why I gave it a novelty of a 7. Maybe 7's a little too high, just because the idea is, like, out there quite a lot. For entertainment, I gave it a 5.5. I found it entertaining because it was interesting, but I could certainly see someone finding it quite a bit dry. 5.5 might be too high. This is kind of just how I felt about it. It's kind of a hard book to rate because it's like a scientific book, and if you don't find the science interesting, it's not going to be very interesting, and it's going to be like a slog to get through. I think that a lot of the important ideas could be acquired elsewhere, and not necessarily through this. That could be acquired through more entertaining means or faster means, like Memetics, the book I would recommend over it, or like The Virus in the Mind by Richard Brody, if you wanted to learn about memetics. If you wanted to learn about like iterative processes, that might be a different book, but this is a good solid book for like kind of the ideas underpinning it all, which is evolutionary biology. So, and also seeing stuff at the perspective of the gene rather than as the individual, of which, you know, the brother altruism thing is a good example. Okay, so for style I gave it a 7. I actually quite like Dawkins' writing style. I like his speaking style as well. I'm somewhat to degree a fan of him. I think he is in like the early 2000s there was this like 4 Horsemen of the Counter-Apocalypse thing, of which I'm somewhat familiar with, I guess one of them, which is Christopher Hitchens, which I'm more familiar with, David Dennet, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. And these guys were the anti-theists, or had this like very anti-theistic movement. In my mind, the movement gained a ton of popularity as a result of, you know, the 9/11 attacks and the anti-Islamic sentiment in the United States. I think that a lot of these thinkers kind of were already thinking these ideas beforehand, but I think a big reason why they rose to popularity was a result of, you know, the anti-Islamic sentiment, which brought about an anti-religious sentiment in general. Dawkins, if I'm going to be critical of Dawkins, which this is kind of what this is prefacing, is that I think that this anti-theistic movement is just it misses the mark. I don't think they demonize to use a turn of phrase, I don't think they demonize the right thing. You know, I don't think religion's the problem. I think people who are atheists can be like evil, if you want to use the word evil, and people who are religious can be evil. And okay, of the 4 that I've heard speak, I don't actually, of the 4 excluding David Dennet, because I'm not as familiar with Dennet, my feeling is that Richard Dawkins was kind of the most patient in explaining and most truth and conversation oriented of the anti-religious group. And I like him for that, but I also don't like him because I think he's anti-religious to an extent that is a little bit too far. I guess not even too far. Christopher Hitchens was kind of just like a bit of a jerk. Although I really like Hitchens, I don't agree with his anti-theistic sentiment. Anyways, a little bit of a tangent. As far as readability goes, I think it's fairly readable. You know, it's a science book. It's always hard for me to rate these books because, like, okay, I think it's readable given what the content is, and he does a good job explaining it. And, you know, a lot of it is just examples of animals and looking in the animal kingdom and saying, like, look, here's an example of this concept, and here's why it illustrates this. And, you know, how in a lot of ways it's just like it's interesting to read about, like, the cuckoos, which are birds that lay eggs in other nests, and how, you know, there's like a bit of an arms race between the birds to identify which ones are the cuckoos, and the cuckoos to disguise themselves better, and like this sort of thing. Which illustrates some of the ideas he talks about, but then, you know, in the end he's talking about somewhat complex and nuanced ideas that are not necessarily intuitive. You know, that the gene is the individual, like, level at which analysis should occur is not necessarily readily apparent. And so maybe readability should be lower. I gave it a 6. I think he did a good job with it. If someone has read this book and they think the book is just really, really rough, please let me know and I'll like pin the comment or whatever. But I think it's manageable. Okay. And another thing with readability is there's a book I scored as like being really readable, and then I had a conversation with someone who I find intelligent, and they said it was really hard to read, and now I don't know how to rate these books anymore. Okay, for interesting, I gave it an 8. Very solid, very interesting. I think that it not only is interesting in its own right, but it unlocks a model of reality or a perspective, you know, evolutionary biology, which you don't have to get from this book, you know, itself. It's available in a lot of different spots. I think it's an important model of reality to have that's particularly interesting and opens up new avenues towards analyzing stuff, like, for example, talking about memetics and ideas and thinking about ideas in terms of, is this a good idea or is it just good at spreading? Because we have a cognitive bias to just think that the most popular idea is a good idea. I forget what the name of the fallacy, or it's not a fallacy, the name of the bias is. I know Daniel Kahneman talks about it in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, but we have this sort of bias to think that the popular idea is good, and it's no. An idea being popular is just indicative that it's good at being popular, which, to be fair, sometimes ideas are being good at being popular, but something that's kind of prods our, emotional buttons and is, like, very, very simple is very, very spreadable. So, like, oversimplifications, black and white thinking, stuff to do with sex, violence, danger, all these things are going to spread much better than, like, quality ideas. And then you also have to, like, be on the lookout for ideas that are, really good for your well-being, but really bad at spreading. So, like, taking a multivitamin is not particularly sexy, right? But it could just be, like, one of the lowest effort ways to increase your quality of life. Not because multivitamin is likely to do anything, because for the most part, if you have a balanced diet, they just don't do anything. But because if in the event that you do have a deficiency in something, the simple act of just swallowing a pill every day is so easy, and, like, eliminating a deficiency is so so useful for you that, like, it's just worth it. But, like, so an idea like this spreading, take your multivitamin, it's not going to spread very easily because it doesn't have the qualities that make for good spread, much in the same way, like, so Halloween, the candy, the razor blades and the candy, this spreads well. But talking to your kid about how, each additional piece of candy has diminishing marginal utility, this is a fair thing that could be actually quite useful, but it's not, like, sexy or dangerous. It's also complicated and not necessarily easy to explain. But the idea is this: the first candy bar you have is going to be more enjoyable than the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or the sixth. And if you have 100 candy bars, you're actually probably have negative utility from the 100th candy bar. It's going to make you sick. And so what you could do as a kid, a strategy for enjoying the candy as much as possible, is to space it out as much as possible. And you can explain this to the kid. And if they don't believe you, make them eat all 100 until they throw up, and then they'll believe you. No, but, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, you can explain an idea that's actually somewhat complex in a way that a kid can understand regarding strategies for eating Halloween candy in order to enjoy it the most, and actually also enjoy it in a more healthy way, which is, like, over the course of a long period of time. And this could be an idea that would spread on Halloween, but for obvious reasons, it's not good at spreading, or it's not spreading not because it's not useful, but because it's not good at spreading. I think I've talked on about this quite a bit. I also think that I might be making a book list of books that kind of talk about iterative processes, and that this book would be kind of like the foundation of the list, where it's talking about the underlying mechanics, and then going into some other books that are more practical application. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, the YouTube algorithm stuff. If you didn't like this video, dislike it, or, and this is even better for you if you really don't like the video, don't dislike it. Also, why did you watch to the end? The reason why you would not want to dislike it is because dislikes juice the algorithm. Also, don't comment if you didn't like it, because comments juice the algorithm, even if you hated it. Sorry about that. Also, I recommend a better strategy in terms of deciding how long to watch a video. You've been watching for 28 minutes and you didn't like it. Anyways, I hope your day improves if that's the case. Otherwise, have a good day.